Everything's bigger in Texas, or so the saying goes. And that's true even in a small town like Carthage, because what the town may lack in size, it more than makes up for in heart.
You bigger cities, you got a house burn, they say, well, we hate the house burn. Here, somebody's house burn, everybody starts getting together, they get on the radio station, they start gathering clothes. They start gathering different things that people need. People look after each other.
In the summer of 1997, there wasn't anyone who looked after the people of Carthage more than Bernie Teedy. And that was on top of his full-time job taking care of Marjorie Nugent. Although thanks to his busy schedule tending to Mrs. Nugent, Bernie was giving more money than time to his volunteer work. In fact, Bernie had become one of Panola College's biggest boosters.
If students needed help and maybe we had used all of our scholarship money and didn't have any additional money left, Bernie provided students with scholarship money for books or dormitories or tuition fees.
Bernie gave one couple money to buy a new house. He gave another friend the money to open a clothing store, Boots, Scoot, and Western Wear. And when the Methodist Church started raising money to build a new sanctuary, Bernie pledged $100,000.
And in the 10 years that he had been here, he had just become one of the leading citizens of Carthage.
There was, however, one little thing.
It sort of bothered everybody. We didn't know where the money was coming from.
Or did they? That was a lot of money. But as long as Bernie's checkbook was open, Carthage took a don't ask, don't tell approach to where the money came from.
I kept thinking, where does that I can't just do that for somebody, just write a check, and he just said, well, he just grinned and laughed and never explained it in any detail.
And if Bernie was spreading a little of Marjorie Nugent's money around, so what? It wasn't like she was Carthage's most beloved citizen.
She was, I guess a good East Texas word, ornery.
So ornery that it was nearly 9 months before anyone missed her. In July of 1997, an elderly woman who went to church with Mrs. Nugent contacted the Panola County Sheriff's Department.
She hadn't seen or heard from her in several months. Was kind of concerned about where whereabouts might be.
The deputies naturally called Bernie. He had a simple explanation. Mrs. Nugent was ill. She checked into a hospital out of town under an assumed name so she wouldn't be bothered.
He said that she didn't want her family to know where she was because she was afraid that they would, take control of her assets and all and probably put her in a retirement home.
Just to make sure, the sheriff's deputies decided to contact the hospital. Good thing, too, because as they say in Texas, something just weren't right.
There was no one down there with her Social Security number or that fit her description.
Finally, on August 18th, the sheriff decided it was time to check out the big house on the edge of town.
I sent my investigators to the residence to see if she was there, we could find any trace of her. Anything to lead us to know where she might be.
Once inside, it was apparent the house hadn't been lived in for a while.
They found, as I understand it, flies that had died in windows. They found mail that was unopened that was in November of '96.
But no sign of Mrs. Nugent. There was, however, one odd thing that Deputy Mims noticed.
I walked into the little pantry room there where the freezer was and looked over at the freezer, and there was 2 pieces of tape on the freezer on the door to keep it closed, which just seemed awful strange to me.
Although not nearly as strange as what Deputy Mims found inside the freezer.
The freezer was fairly full of food items, and there was a little wire basket in the left corner of the freezer there, and I looked up underneath it and seen a head.
Attached to that head was a rest of Marjorie Nugent. As icy as ever.
Marjorie Nugent had not been seen, for months, and we had found her in the freezer. I thought, well, we sure have been lied to. We've been deceived, on a grand scale.
In the interrogation room, Deputy Jeter handled the question.
Of course, I've known him for years, and I asked him, what has happened, and Mr. Teedy, he stated to me that, she had evidently been kidnapped, and that he had received some calls, just right after she went missing, which was like 9 months prior.
Somehow, that didn't strike Jeter as too likely.
I said, I've known you for a long time. You're a man. Men take responsibility for their actions. And, these lies, they're just not going to cut it. Now, what happened? And that's when he said, well, I shot her.
Shoot someone? Bernie? He should have stuck to the kidnapping story. Bernie wasn't a murderer, if anything. The man was a saint.
Father, for those who are ill, who are not able to be with us for one reason or another, we ask that you.
This guy has preached services, sang, did funerals, worked funeral, and seemed like such a nice person. How could people think he did it?
Well, he did confess, and the crime lab did find 4 .22 caliber slugs in Mrs. Nugent's body. But that still wasn't enough to shake some folks' faith in Bernie.
Once it became public knowledge that he had confessed, there were still people that couldn't believe it.
And if Bernie really had shot the ornery old lady, well, some folks in Carthage figured she drove him to it.
Different ones said she had a temper, this, that, and the other, but that's no reason to shoot somebody in the back with a .22 rifle.
When the trial began on February 1st, 1999, it was clear that District Attorney Danny Buck Davidson didn't intend to use the confession as a crutch. Danny Buck, as he's known around Panola County, launched into the proceedings with a dramatic flair even Bernie would have appreciated. In his opening statement, the DA portrayed the accused not just as a cold-blooded killer, but a cold-hearted liar to boot.
He managed to skillfully, by forgery, transfer all the monies into the account that he had the power of attorney on. And he ran through $5 to $6 million over money.
Missing money that, the way the cops figured it, ultimately led to Marjorie Nugent's death.
We have always believed that she called him and said, we're going to the bank. They called, and there's some questions about, the expenditures. And I believe, and so do the investigators, that he panicked.
And at that point in time, he had to make a choice. His choice was, we ain't going to the bank.
And once Mrs. Nugent was dead, Bernie deceived an entire town into thinking she was still alive.
A man that could fool the town for a little over 9 months, that's pretty good actor.
When the jury filed back into the box at 12:30 that afternoon, Bernie still had more than half the town rooting for his acquittal, which was pretty amazing considering he'd confessed to the crime.
People at his church and his friends, and certainly people he had helped in business, those people that were in the thick of it were kind of in denial.
And there were at least 5 or 6 million reasons why.
Among the citizens here, it was like a Robin Hood, taking from the rich and giving to the poor.
He probably made a good politician at some point, other than that whole murder thing.
Robin Hood didn't kill the people he was taking from.
And it made all the difference. Almost 2 years after Deputy Joe Mims found Mrs. Nugent in the deep freeze, the jury made it official. Bernie Teedy was a murderer. On top of the guilty verdict, the jury sentenced him to life in prison.
The jury verdict was life and a $10,000 fine, which was the maximum sentence they could have imposed on him. which I think justice demanded that he receive.
Although thanks to Bernie, nowadays, Carthage takes a little more care when it comes to choosing caretakers.
It shook up the community, shook up a lot of people, took away their trust. Just couldn't believe that a person that acted as loving and caring as he did could do something like this. But he did.